Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Fernandez, she, her pronouns. I am a brown woman with curly hair, wearing a powder blue suit today, and I have a braille display on my lap. And I am so delighted to be here with Francois Klump from Kearney. I am the global lead for engagement for Cisco Systems at the Office of Accessibility. And welcome to our fireside chat on authentic representation. Here we're going to be talking about what is authentic representation of disability, why it's important, and what is our journey like to get there. And so I want to turn it over to Francois at this point to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do, and a little bit about Kearney, and we can get started.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. It's great to meet you and very excited to be here today. So for everyone in the audience, I'm Francois Klomp, a middle, late 20s Caucasian male with brown hair wearing a black suit, pronouns he, him. Super excited to be here today. So I guess a little bit of background around me. I'm the Employee Resource Group lead for Middle East and Africa at Kearney for people living with disabilities, as well as a kind of project lead for the Authentic Representation Tool development project we ran alongside the Valuable 500. So super excited to be talking about this today because it's something that's close to my heart and something that we actually delivered quite a long project on. And yeah, just excited to be here and share some of my perspectives.
Yeah, amazing. So, Francois, let's start off with what is the the Authentic Representation Project? What inspired you to get started at Kearney and why it's so important to do this work?
Yep, 100%. So I guess a little bit of the background as part of the Valuable 500's kind of commitment statement to end disability exclusion with their Sync 25 conference. One of the pillars was representation. As part of this, it's to ensure authentic representation and supporting their signatories in kind of progressing that or realizing that statement. After kind of working closely with the Valuable 500, we realized that sometimes, a lot of organizations don't know what that means or how to even do that. So we identified a tool called the Authentic Representation Tool, or the ART. Personally, really like that acronym, to practically lay down what it is, how to get there, and how to close the gap of where you are now, where you want to go. Before I jump into the project itself, to put it frankly, for me, authentic representation means or reflects truth. So it authentically shares people's experiences in an objective and reflective manner versus being this fluffed up version of the truth, especially in today's social media age. So I think for me, it's making an authentic story that is relatable every day. And I always come back to the example of instead of having someone kind of rise from the ashes and have this inspirational story every single time to reflect good in your organization, it's just sharing, as an example, someone in a wheelchair drinking a Coke with their friends. That for me is authentic representation. It's not only in how you share the stories, it's having people with disabilities in creation of those stories, as well as the content that you put out. So the frequency, the stories, as well as people being involved in the making of those stories. That to me is really authentic representation in a nutshell.
And one of the things that I would love to touch on, when I think about authentic representation and storytelling, is that oftentimes when we don't have this representation in stories and we don't make them available to people, people with disabilities are often burdened with having to educate and having to do all of that labor, that emotional labor, when you meet someone, when you're new to a team. And so I would love to talk a little bit about what has been the impact of this initiative, of the storytelling. How
Yes.
has it been received, and what are some of the tangible impacts that you've seen?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So I think there's kind of been a direct impact as well as an indirect impact. Let
Mm-hmm.
me touch on the direct impact first. So I think this tool was designed with executives in mind. So almost being a self-assessment tool. We know that there's a lot a lot of things on executives' plates, something like your CMO, so Chief Marketing Officer. They've got a million things on their plate. While the idea of this tool was to give a snapshot of a self-reflection tool. So it literally gives a view of where are you now, where do you want to head to with authentic representation, and how do you close that gap. In terms of how to support people, is we also linked resources to it. So as an example, a firm would be, do you have a disability policy for any stories that you share? If you don't, it links you to a consultancy or a resource that the Valuable 500 provides to show you practically how does that, or how to close that gap. And for me, it really helps to stay targeted. Indirectly, I think through the project, just to use an example, is when you do the right thing, or kind of make sure that you do the authentically right thing, the net positive outcome is fantastic. So even at Carney, when we were doing this project, we realized that our accessibility processes also need a revamp. And then we worked with our kind of creative services team to detail this process. And currently, all of our documents are being kind of pushed through accessibility standards, which wasn't necessarily the case beforehand. So it's been both a direct and an indirect impact, and it was just an incredible 8 weeks that we supported the Valuable 500 on.
I love that. And one of the things that I often think about and talk about is that disability is not a monolith, that disability is the only identity that can impact anyone anytime in their lives. And so when we think about that, and when we think about storytelling and this concept of authentic representation, one of the things that is always severely lacking is like the variety of disability, as well as the other layered on identities, because we're not just that one identity. And so I'm wondering, what impact has it had on other identities to bring forth authentic representation, knowing that disability doesn't look the same and isn't the same, and that no two disabled people are the same? What has that been like?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's a great question. So I think building on that point, two quotes that I love is disability community is the only one you can join overnight, as well as there's 1.3 billion different disabilities. It's not all the same, right? There's different levels varying. There's also the intersectionality aspect. So as you mentioned, I think for me, by highlighting the kind of, how you can improve your authentic narratives and your authentic representation, you can kind of look into that intersectional aspect. So as an example, what we've been doing at Carney is we also have an employee resource group called Black at Carney, as well as the Women's Network, and we've actually collaborated with them on International Women's Day as an example, or Black History Month, and almost highlighting the intersectional aspect of disability, where you have like multiple identities. So I think for me, it's just been sharing those stories in an authentic manner and creating the space to share those stories. That's been the biggest impact.
And I always like to say, Francois, when we tell people that disability is the only identity you can join any moment, that this is not a threat, it's real. So it's just a reality of life. And in some ways, I find it really interesting that disability is like the one identity that really ties together the fabric of humanity. It can be a place of starting from when we think about what is something that unites us as an entire collective is in fact disability. And at the same time, it's so interesting to me that it is the one identity that has been so erased from the human imagination, right? And like that's why we need to have these initiatives. I want to pivot a little bit to think about talent. We're at a conference really thinking about how to remove barriers to increase employment for people with disabilities, which is the one identity that has the lowest employment rate globally. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. And so I wanted to kind of think about, for you, what are some of the impacts that you think about when you think about talent, retaining and recruiting and retaining the best talent, and that talent being disabled? What does the authentic representation piece have to do with that? Because that might not be intuitive sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, no, 100%. So I think for me, it all comes down to, and the reason why I think retention sometimes doesn't translate from recruitment, it
Mm-hmm.
depends on your why. So I think why you're recruiting, is it just to kind of meet targets, or is it to
Mm-hmm.
actually improve as an organization? Um, so that's one big component, and then the second component for me is accessibility. So for me, it's just getting the accessibility play right, um, and not being, I'd say, prescriptive in what accessibility requirements are kind of approved, as an example. So just having a broad policy is not necessarily enabling someone living with a disability who's really a superstar, or, can help foster growth in your organization. But understanding what their needs are, because for me, it's just removing things that don't allow them to perform at their full potential, right? It's like basic basic rights, if you think about it that way. So for me, it's getting the accessibility right, as well as getting the why right.
Yeah, and I love that piece around the why. And I think for me, oftentimes when we think about a collective identity, when we think about disability, if you've never met someone with a disability, it's so easy to dehumanize people, right? It's like those people over there that have access needs. And I think what's so important when we think about the authentic representation is that we humanize people, of like we're literally humans with the same wants, needs, desires as every other human,
Yes.
and our minds and bodies work differently and have different needs, and that's
Yeah.
okay. And what I think for me, what it comes to for talent is like all of a sudden you're humanizing your coworkers who may have
Mm-hmm.
different access needs than you do. I'm
Yes.
blind, so I always like to say, my sighted colleagues need the light. I don't, but I accommodate you.
Yeah.
And so I love like that piece, to lean into that.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think 2 points to add there. I was at a global disability conference, I think 2 years ago, and I met one kind of person who had a hearing impairment, and it was my first time really interacting with someone and with a hearing impairment. What I realized is, um, you know, it's almost like the other senses got supercharged, as well as, being blind. I've heard someone have that screen reader that translates it, and it's so fast. I don't know what's being read, but your other senses adapt. So it's almost like just not seeing it as a place of pity, but being like, "What? That's incredible! Like it's absolutely incredible," and seeing it as, completely embraced by society. That's the first one, and then the second one for me is almost looking at, especially if you're looking at an authentic representation tool targeted at the C-suite level,
Yes.
understanding that aside from being the right thing to do, it also makes business sense. So 15 to 20% of people globally live with a disability, but people often overlook the extended community, so family, friends, etc. Um, and that represents $13 trillion according to the World Economic Forum. So it just makes business sense to have these policies in place and be or focus on authentic representation. So as an example, even though I don't live with a disability, my niece does. So by extension, it affects what I purchase, where I do business, who I interact with, and sometimes people just forget it.
Yeah. So we have about 1 minute left. And so, Francois, I just want to open it up for you for any kind of closing thoughts on your journey, kind of what your hope for the future is, perhaps, or anything else you want to share with our audience before we sign off.
100%. No, I just want to thank you for the time. It's been a fantastic discussion so far. And I just want to, motivate the audience. Once the authentic representation tool or the art is launched, please reach out to the Valuable 500, or myself as well, and just kind of ask about how can that help us improve our authentic representation, and how does that benefit our organization. So I would just challenge everyone out there leading up to this December, just to read up on it a little bit. It's really exciting work.
Thank you so much. For one, I am so grateful that you're doing this work. Stories have the power to change the way that we see the world. And so having a true representation of the world, including people with disabilities, is so crucial in everything that we do. Thank you all, and stay tuned for our next fireside chat coming up after this. It's been a pleasure, and I will see you again, I think, on Friday. Thank you, Francois.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.